In the last video, I said that the Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact military alliance of Soviet-influenced nations. Well, today, as we talk about the contemporary coups and conflicts, really these are words for war, we are talking about the major start in 1991 of a new kind of war in Iraq. So that's another reason to say that the Cold War is over with this new type of hot war. Although some of the Cold War feelings are still here. The photo in the background of this slide shows the Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez in a military parade celebrating the anniversary of the failed 2002 coup d'etat against him. I don't know if there's evidence to clearly show that the US was behind this coup, but we do know when the coup happened, the US didn't mind. They were happy with the replacement of the socialist-leaning Hugo Chavez, and they would support the coup d'etat. Again, in 2009 in Honduras, there was a coup d'etat against a popularly elected president, and the US has now begun supporting the coup makers. But these incidents, while they still may occur, are not as common as they used to be. So in today's lesson, we're going to focus on hot wars and other military movements after the Cold War. So the big one I talked about in 1991 is the Persian Gulf War, which is said to have cured the US of the Vietnam-itis. You know, Vietnam, lasting until 1975, was arguably the first major military defeat of the United States. Even if it wasn't a complete defeat, it certainly was not a complete victory, as most US wars had been up to that point. After this incredibly quick and seemingly successful war against Iraq, the US military power probably felt quite strong and somewhat victorious, as it was clear that the Soviet Union at this time was dissolving. The US could say that this was a coalition of forces. You can see in the map that, yes, most of the NATO countries did support the US in this invasion, but it also had support from various countries on various continents. Critically, it had the support of some neighboring Arab countries, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria. And then in Central Asia, it had the support of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Even as late as 1991, Afghanistan was a supporting nation. They didn't send troops, but they were a supporting nation for this invasion. It's a sign of how quick things can change, because remember too, Iraq was a key ally in the 1980s of the United States. The cause for this war was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, a neighboring country. Now, we haven't had any time to do Mideast history in this course, and I'm not about to begin now. But Iraq felt it had the okay from the US to attack Iran in the 80s, and they may have thought they would be able to attack Kuwait. But this provided such a golden chance for the US to stand up and take a strong role in a world which is now becoming unipolar. That is, rather than bipolar with Soviet Union and America, somewhat equals, the US could be the clear leader of the entire world, like they were for that brief period in the late 1940s. But no, the US was sure they were going to not allow the invasion of Kuwait. Now, the Palestine-Israel conflict has certainly complicated things in this region since the end of World War II. You can pause the video, look at the map, do your own research about this. But I just want to say that the US has always shown so much support for Israel that Iraq thought there was a double standard. Iraq even offered to withdraw from Kuwait if the US and other nations would recognize Israel-occupied Palestine as a state. Iraq probably knew that the US wouldn't accept this. But even if this was just political bluffing, the tension between Jewish Israel and Muslim surrounding area is always a factor in any politics that the US is a part of in this area. But I don't want you to think it's just a religious thing. In the spirit of this course, I want to remind you that we supported Iraq in the 1960s when Saddam Hussein's group overthrew a government which was communist. So them being anti-communist was one of the key factors for supporting Iraq. And we had supported Iraq for quite a long time. Perhaps Iraq thought that we would still support them in Kuwait. Whatever the truth was, the US established itself as a clear winner. Later in the same decade, NATO was tested. In the mid-90s, in the wars in the Balkans, NATO was a little bit unsure of itself. After all, the Warsaw Pact had been gone for 4 years. Was there really still a need for NATO? Well, by the end of the 90s, with support from the United States, the Clinton administration encouraged NATO to intervene more heavily in the wars in the Balkans. And perhaps this conflict has really shown that the NATO alliance is going to stay together. Again, having implications for actions in Ukraine right now. All right, well, 9/11 happened. September 11th, 2001, in the first 8 months of the George Bush presidency. This event certainly defined the Bush presidency. Was it a major turning point in US foreign policy? I don't think so. Not as much as 1991 was. Some of the factors put in place from 1991 were accelerated because of September 11th. Let me first explain something that was happening domestically, because this did have ripple effect on the international geopolitical relations. This is the USA PATRIOT Act. The first major policy shift, especially domestically. It authorized unwarranted wiretapping, which meant that the government could listen in on the phone calls or other communications without getting a warrant from the court. It was allowed to intercept digital and analog data. It broadened the definition of terrorist so that the US could arrest people suspected of terrorism and not give them all of the rights which they normally would get under the US Constitution and general policy of being a fair country. It was enacted very quickly, just 1.5 months after the September 11th attacks, and probably wasn't examined well by the lawmakers. Even so, it has been renewed by both the Bush and Obama administrations. Now we know from leaks from Edward Snowden, a former National Security Agency advisor, that the spying was widespread, domestic and international. The US even spied on many NATO allies, attempting to gain advantage in negotiations. A lot of that was for trade, which we will talk about next week. After the creation of the Patriot Act was the establishment in November 2002 of the Department of Homeland Security. And this indicated more of a willing to increase funding and attention on defense and security and so on, because this is the war on terror. This is a policy shift to say that we can declare war and carry out acts which are normally reserved for a war between nations when we are fighting something called terror, which is nationless. So this is a shift of policy, certainly in name. But if you consider the amount of clandestine and covert operations which were taking place during the Cold War, the idea of attacking people and institutions which are not officially nations has been a policy since the end of World War II. But still, the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan was the first major aggressive act, which started less than a month after the September 11th attacks, even though nobody from Afghanistan was one of the hijackers, one of the 19 hijackers. In fact, 15 of the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. But the US demanded Afghanistan extradite Osama bin Laden, our former ally, against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. I mentioned the negotiation tactic of Saddam Hussein, saying he would withdraw from Kuwait if US recognized Israel. Well, the US knew the Taliban were not going to give up Osama bin Laden, so this was not a real bargaining tool given by them. The US was prepared to attack Afghanistan, no matter what. And if we believe Richard Clarke, who was a member of the Bush cabinet during the September 11th attacks, nothing was going to stop the Bush administration from attacking Iraq as well. According to Richard Clarke, the Bush administration wanted to blame Iraq for the September 11th attacks from the very beginning. They attempted to do this, and their information turned out to be false. Is that called a lie? But the US attacked Iraq 1.5 years after the September 11th attacks. After September 11th, it is significant that military spending has increased dramatically. Please note that all figures on this graph after 2011 are estimates. Please also note that this is a graph from Wikipedia. Just looking at the bottom sort of, light green colored, colored line, this is Defense Department spending, which peaked at somewhere around $700 billion under the Obama administration. So in the early 90s, some people thought there may be a peace dividend. With the end of the Cold War, maybe we could stop spending so much on military. And during the 90s, with the Clinton administration, you can see on this graph, defense spending did go down. But in the 2 years before September 11th, and with the strong NATO alliance presence in the Balkans, military spending had begun to increase again. And now this is a trend which the Bush administration accelerated very quickly. So I don't know if it's just because of September 11th that military spending increased so much. It probably allowed the increase because of the war on terror. I'm not going to talk about this map very much, but I think it's interesting. If you don't know the US situation of bases around the world and a level of US troop presence around the world, pause the video and look at this map for a little bit. The point is, the US is involved in many places around the world, but Southwest, Central, and East Asia are probably the most important. Well, as I'm sure you know, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are absolute messes. Militarily, the US has little to celebrate since 2011, and I think few people would consider the military engagements in the Balkans a success. With the exception of the major victory in 1991 against Iraq, the US has not had a good record in overt wars since World War II. Korea was not a success. Vietnam was not a success. What's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq right now are absolute disasters. This is probably why covert war on terror is preferable to the US. War is just too complicated these days. That's why the US isn't sure what to do about the Arab Spring. I show here a picture of protesters in Cairo's Tahrir Square, February 2011, which for me is the peak of the euphoria surrounding the Arab Spring. It was, unfortunately, a very short-lived period of excitement and hope for the region. But in February of 2011, the Egyptian leader, strongman Mubarak, who had been in power for 30 years, stepped down, and it seemed as if a new chapter may be written in Middle East politics. The US wasn't sure what to do. Egypt has long been a strong ally for the US in this region. In fact, in 1956, the US supported Egypt over Britain and France when those three countries had a fight about the Suez Canal. That's how important Egypt is and has been to the US in terms of geopolitical strategy. So, to help define which countries are geopolitically important for the US, let me ask you, which countries historically receive the most US military aid? Speaking roughly for the last 40 years, the top three positions are consistent. Israel is always first, Egypt is usually next, and third spot is often Colombia. But the budgets for Israel and Egypt are usually much higher than those for other countries. Rounding out the top five would be Pakistan and Jordan. To demonstrate Egypt's importance, consider that US military aid to that country in 2012, the year after the Arab Spring Revolution, it was $1.3 billion, and the numbers haven't changed significantly despite various regime changes. So again, it's not democracy that matters as much as stability and willingness to go with US economic policy. Elsewhere in the region, the US intervened in Libya for only a short time and then left, and now the country is in terrible shape. US has supported the Bahrain government, although that government has been very heavy-handed in its treatment of protesters. And the US has hesitated with Syria. Obviously, an extremely complicated situation, and one that covert or overt operations can't seem to solve. So, despite the failure of the United States military to win overt wars since the end of World War II, they are continuing the strategy of military bases surrounding the world, ready to respond to regional conflicts and willing to do it. This trend has continued despite the loss of a threat from the Soviet Union. But perhaps it is just this willingness to surround the globe, to be willing to attack, that is the US policy in support of their economic policy, which we will talk about next week.